Hi, I'm Donna McNeil. I'm the Episcopal Missioner to MSU and the advisor for Canterbury MSU. We're delighted that you're joining us this evening and watching this video and hopefully joining our watch party and the chat. If you're watching this later, feel free to add comments or questions and I'll respond in the next few days. So it's Inauguration Day, the day that we're premiering this, and it is perhaps the strangest inauguration in American history. Certainly the strangest in our lifetime, hopefully for the length of our lifetime. Before we move too quickly forward, I thought it was worth looking back at the attack on the Capitol and at where it sits in the stream of US history. It's clear that a lot of the energy behind the criticisms of this current election are rooted in white supremacy. The votes that have been most challenged are those of people of color. So, for example, the challenge to the votes in Detroit. This has been true in many places in the country. And the following video and recording with Tim Wise, talk a little bit about where we've been before and where this sits. So this is not the first time that there has been an attempted coup in a US election. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, a coup was successful in Wilmington, North Carolina. And that's the first piece we'll listen to. And then a podcast that features Tim Wise, who is a longtime advocate for anti-racism. He's a white guy from the South who talks strongly, directly. He doesn't pull any punches about white supremacy and the ways in which those of us who are white support and further racism. He may not be everyone's cup of tea, and that's okay, but he's worth listening to and thinking about. You don't have to agree with everything he says or the way he says it, but he's definitely worth listening to. So I hope that you'll listen to the end. And again, if you have comments or questions, please share them. Thanks.
The violence we saw at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th was deeply shocking, prompting many people to say, this doesn't happen in America. But in fact, extreme violence associated with elections has happened many times before, often associated with issues of race. One extreme example is documented in the book Wilmington's Lie, the murderous coup of 1898 and the rise of white supremacy. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Zucchino started writing it 5 years ago and says what happened at the attempted insurrection at the Capitol is no surprise. The anger fueled by fear, charges of fraud, and lies at the Capitol last week quite simply has happened before in American history, and author David Zucchino wants the world to know it. This was a tough book to get through. Why did you write it, and who did you write it for?
I wrote it because I went to high school and college in North Carolina, and yet I had never heard about this event, and I was shocked that something like this could happen in the United States. So I decided I really wanted to correct the historical record because the way that the white supremacists portrayed it was completely false.
The events he describes in Wilmington's Lie took place in Wilmington, North Carolina on November 10, 1898. The violent overthrow of a multiracial government by a white supremacist mob. There have been plenty of other large-scale, racially motivated assaults through the years, including the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, nearly a century ago. But Zucchino, who won his Pulitzer Prize covering apartheid in South Africa, says Wilmington was something different.
This one was unique and distinctive because all of those other riots, there was a spark, and it was usually some sort of contact between a black man and a white woman. In this case, it was premeditated. It was planned for months.
Planned, strategized, and just like last week, involved a league of infiltrators aligned with the movement of white supremacy.
They themselves called it a white supremacy campaign, and it was designed to overthrow an elected government, a multiracial government in Wilmington, and it succeeded. It's the only armed overthrow of an elected government in American history.
In the 1890s, post-Reconstruction, Wilmington was an outlier, a town with a black population of 56% that found common ground with white populists and Republicans.
It was probably the most racially tolerant and racially integrated city in the South. You had 3 of the 10 city councilmen were black, 10 of the 26 policemen were black, there were black magistrates, there was a very thriving and successful black middle class.
And much like the current Stop the Steal attacks on President-elect Joe Biden, Zucchino says the argument back then insinuated that the black vote was fraudulent.
It was designed to keep black men from voting ever again and to keep black men from holding public office because this was an existential threat to white supremacy.
Similar to the present, voices in the media pushed a narrative. A local paper, the News and Observer, incited whites to overthrow black elected officials. And because 25% of whites were illiterate, it wasn't always with words. Then how they utilized art, political cartoons to carry the day.
Right. This was all part of the disinformation and the big lie. In North Carolina at that time, one of them had a picture of a black man that looked like a claw reaching out and grasping fleeing white women. I mean, it was just horrible, but it had a very incendiary effect on white voters. It just pushed all their buttons about the insecurities they already had.
But editor Alexander Manley pushed back in his Daily Record, the only black daily newspaper in the state.
He enraged the whites in August of 1898 when he wrote an editorial saying that most of the black men who were lynched for allegedly raping white women were in fact their consensual lovers. And he also pointed out that for generations, white men had been raping black women with impunity.
3 months after Manley's editorial ran and 2 days after the election, a mob of armed white citizens led by former Confederate officer Alfred Moore Waddell set the paper ablaze and forced out Wilmington's mayor and city council. 60 black men were killed in the streets that day, and black voting rights were limited for more than 7 decades. Some of those same techniques used in 1898 remain in the political arena today. Did you see the tea leaves in the election of 2016?
Oh, yeah. When he came down that escalator to announce his run, he talked about Mexican rapists, and he used that word, coming across the border.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
To steal American jobs. And that is the same message that the white supremacists used.
We had an election that was stolen from us.
The big lie to the disinformation that if you repeat a lie often enough and loudly enough, people will believe it, and not only that, they will act on it.
So the legacy here, the lesson.
The lesson is that there is power in disinformation, there is power in lies, that it is quite easy for a skilled demagogue like President Trump and like the leaders of the white supremacy movement to incite people based on their fears and grievances.
Do you have any hope we can move beyond this?
Well, people like Stacey Abrams and the women in Georgia who worked so hard to fight voter suppression gives me great hope. In this country, there is that deep, deep undercurrent hatred among whites and fears and grievances who feel that they have no choice but to use violence to take back what they think is their country. And that worries me a lot.
The lasting impact, consider this. In 1896, 2 years before the coup, there were 126,000 black men registered to vote. 4 years after that, 125,000. My eyesight's going. In North Carolina, I should say. 4 years after the coup in 1902, that number had whittled down to just 6,100, and it went down from there. There wasn't an African American voted into the State House of North Carolina until 1969, into Congress until the 1970s, and in Wilmington, they didn't see it until 1972.
Tim Wise is the guest on this installment of The Truth Report. He is one of America's and the world's leading experts on white privilege and racism. He's the author of many books, including his most recent, Dispatches from the Race War. On this episode of The Truth Report, Tim Wise explains how whiteness and white privilege and white violence enabled Trump's coup attempt and his fascist mob's lethal assault on the Capitol building on Wednesday. Tim Wise also reflects upon how whiteness and white privilege empowered Trumpists and other fascists and right-wing street thugs to act with impunity in their coup attempt, as well as in other acts of insurrection and treason and violence throughout the age of Trump. And it's one thing to actually have it happen and you wake up and you knew what was going to happen, but it's one thing to see it. I was asking myself this, is your heart beating fast right now or is your hand steady?
Oh, I'm pretty steady. That's the weird thing about knowing. Feel like the conductor on the train that I knew we were going to derail in, 100 or 200 miles. So I sort of had the ability to prepare for the impact. I know that sounds awful, and I'm not trying to say I'm the conductor on this train, God knows, but I find myself in moments like this having this strange calm. And I think it is because I have been so long, for 30 years doing this around racist terrorists and racism. And, even before that, when I was in college and got involved doing left and progressive and radical political work, started getting my life threatened. I think the first time I was telling my oldest is a freshman in college, and I was telling her, the first time my life was ever threatened for the things I say was my freshman year, first semester. But there comes a point when you deal with these folks for 30 years, as I have, and some have dealt with them for a lot longer, you don't find yourself as afraid. I'm not Pollyanna about it. I know what they're capable of. But it's precisely because I've known for a really long time that I don't find myself stunned. And what I heard today that was so weird was in the tone of voice of a lot of people. Lawmakers, representatives who I know I get it, their building was being breached. I'm sure that had to be bizarre and scary in a way. But the tone of voice, their amplitude and their inflection and their pitch suggested to me that they just don't know what country they live in. And it was white politicians, I should say. The black and brown folks that I heard interviewed, Cori Bush, who just got elected, was calm. She was amped in the sense that she's ready to get in there and fight. She wasn't like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. But there were white reps who I gather were just stunned that these people would actually do what they said that they would do. And I've known since I was 18 that this is the shit that they do. And I just wish that, not that people would have listened to me per se, but just listen to all of the people out there, black and brown folks mostly, who have always known what these folks are about and have been trying to tell people.
It's one thing to read about something. So I can explain intellectually, I can cite material, I can explain, fingers crossed, some good measure about whiteness and psychology, history, et cetera, always so much to learn. But I'm not white. They say black and brown folks are experts on racism and white supremacy. Absolutely, but we ain't white. So not asking you to speak for all white brothers and sisters. But what is going on cognitively for folk to be that deluded? Is it they live in another country? And then the surprise, then the shock. Do they just choose not to listen and think it's a joke? But the terrorist is also part of it too, because I was talking to my mother about it. I said, man, I would love to sit down and do some focus groups with these people and ask them what's going on cognitively where they think they're above the law. Did someone sit down and just tell you the law doesn't apply to you? Or you just learn it through observation?
Probably is learned through experience. And today is a confirmation in a way, right? Because they go and they break the law, multiple law. We're not just talking about the most basic laws they broke were trespass and disorderly conduct and a little vandalism. But they're also guilty of breach of the peace. They're guilty of rioting. They're guilty of sedition. They're guilty of insurrection. This is not a protest or a rally or a demonstration. There are noble protest rallies and demonstrations, and even some that I totally disagree with throughout the course of my life on the other side of the political aisle, where people come and they air their grievances and they go home and they make their point, and they might get a little rowdy, but that's part of the tradition, and there's nothing wrong with that. This was different. This was an assault on the seat of government in a way that no black or brown person in this country, no religious minority in this country, no marginalized group could have ever believed themselves capable of getting away with. The only reason these folks did it, it wasn't that they're just more committed to change than progressives and black and brown people are, for God's sake. But the difference is that these people have gotten every signal all of their lives that this would be acceptable and tolerated. They look at the Boston Tea Party. They look at the folks that fired on Fort Sumter. Well, they didn't really learn the lesson there because their side got their ass kicked there. But they see them as these noble heroes who are going to take on the bad guys. There was a young woman today, or clip on TikTok, where she'd been maced after she went into the Capitol. She was stunned that they had done that to her. It was obvious that she had no expectation that this would happen, even though I have no doubt she watched black people and other white people who support black people and black lives getting not just maced, hell, getting tear gassed and shot at with rubber bullets and beaten with clubs during the summer. But she had no anticipation that that would happen to her. And then when she was asked on the clip, well, why'd you come here? She said, we're taking the Capitol. It's a revolution. These people think that they have the right to overthrow the government, when in fact, that's a criminal act. You don't have the right to even advocate the violent overthrow of the government, let alone actually try to do it. But they don't have to know any of that, because whiteness provides this ablative hardening around your comprehension of how the law applies to you. Many of these folks really don't think that the law applies to them. The law was intended to protect them, not be applied to them. Because these are people that are always pro-cop any other day. They're waving the Blue Lives Matter stuff. They've got thin blue line flag. But then when the cops actually try to enforce the law against them, even in a minor level, because they didn't really enforce it very much today, but any level of enforcement, well, wait a minute, whose side are you on? Well, the cops are supposed to be on the side of the law. But these white people have gotten the impression, and not without good reason, that the cops are on the side of whiteness. And that's because law enforcement historically has been just that. And so we've got a much, much deeper problem than these 50,000 or so terrorists in the streets of D.C. today. We have a much deeper problem than Donald Trump and Trumpism. What we have is we have a systemic and institutional crisis within law enforcement, where law enforcement either actively facilitates this kind of thing or passively accepts it.
In private, do some of these white folks say to each other, or have they ever confessed to you, where like, man, if I were black or brown, I'd be dead. Man, I couldn't get away with this. Or is the pathology so deep that it doesn't even occur to them that, man, you know, if I try to overrun, I watched them, armed police with assault rifles, and they pushed past them. Run it, and they made the cops run in the White House, the Capitol building. And I said to myself for a second, if those people were black or brown or Muslim, they would have opened fired and killed a lot of them without hesitation. No way they're running away from a black person.
I haven't really ever asked one of these folks to think about that thought experiment. Could black people get away with the shit you get away with? But I got to be honest, I think deep down, you ask them, not in the heat of the battle, but at some other time. I was reading a piece a couple days ago that Johnny Silvercloud had put on, great photographer and writes a lot of really great essays over on Medium also. He had written a piece. I guess he'd been out interviewing some of the Proud Boys who had been showing up in D.C. even days ago. As a photojournalist, he can get pretty close to them. And he asked them, it's a black man, gets pretty close to them, taking pictures. They're posing for pictures. And he's talking to them. He's even talking to them about BLM. He's asking them questions about, do you believe that black people like me, him talking about himself, ought to be able to be shot for no good reason by police, and that if the police do that, they ought to be able to skate by without punishment. And it's going through the litany of things that we know happen. And he's asking these Proud Boys in a moment, not in the heat of battle, but just like in a moment when they're hanging out and they're doing their thing and they're being sort of just gathering, not really in an angry moment. And he said to a person, they agreed individually that those things that happen to black people are wrong, that kind of treatment is unjust, that it ought not happen. They were expressing a certain degree of individual level sympathy for those things, even though, maybe in a way that was somewhat naive about just how big a problem that really is, but in a way that he actually said he found surprising. But he went on to explain the difference between these people when you get them one-on-one as individuals versus when they are acting as a hive mind as the Proud Boy. So one individual Proud Boy, and I've seen this in other videos, what it says to me is that there is this collective mob mentality that whites have. You can see it in old lynching photos. And then in the heat of hateful passions, whipped into a frenzy by some demagogue, maybe a local demagogue, a national demagogue in the form of the president, they can become this monstrous thing. And this is a very disturbing insight into human psychology, but it's one that we better be clear on, rather than having this naive hope that we can always reach people with reason.
And it's a default script, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't call it out just because it's sort of normalized as part of the culture. So just think about how group responsibility is actively being framed and how it's going to be applied. Black and brown folks, Muslims, whoever the other is, they do not have the benefit, as you and I know, and others certainly know, of being individuals. It's group accountability. If black folks had done this mess, brown folks, Muslims, oh my God, the families, where are the fathers? Bad culture. Are they patriotic? What has gone so wrong in the black community? You're not going to hear that narrative and be like, what's going on in the white home? What's going on with these white Trumpists and their values and patriotism and loyalty and dignity and violence? And I know it's obvious, but we still got to process it. So I'm watching this saying, what's wrong with a certain subset of white people? And you're not going to hear a narrative about white guilt. You're not going to see a white brother on TV, with few exceptions, or sister saying, white America, we got a problem.
The most obvious example, you're not going to hear any politician or pundit getting on television and saying, why aren't other white people condemning this? If this were black folks, there would be a demand. There was a demand 25 years ago that everybody condemn Louis Farrakhan during the period of the Million Man March. And I beg to remind you, not that you need reminding, but that you had roughly 1 million black men descended on DC, and there wasn't a fight. There wasn't a scuffle. There wasn't a broken window. There was no outbreak of crime. There sure as hell was no breaking into the Capitol. But you know what there were? Shit tons of cops everywhere, in the assumption that those people were going to cause trouble. And they didn't. And if Louis Farrakhan had said 1/10 of the kind of stuff to those men that Donald Trump said to the mob today, Farrakhan would still be in prison right now for sedition and trying to overthrow the government. And the Nation of Islam would have been crushed as an organization. And so regardless of what one thinks of Farrakhan or the nation, we know that that is true. So this is the kind of situation we're in, where we know that if black and brown folks even engage in peaceful demonstrations, they will be viewed more seditiously, as insurrectionists, as violent terrorists. And if white folks do the same, they'll be treated much more favorably. That's the most obvious thing. But this bigger piece is that white folks are never called to condemn the actions of our brothers and sisters. And if anyone were to suggest, and even when I do suggest on Twitter, these are white people, folks are like, well, not all white people. Well, of course not. Obviously not every white person. Obviously there are millions of white people that didn't vote for Donald Trump. We all know that. But if black folks were doing this, it would also be a small subset of black people. And yet there would be folks saying, why doesn't the NAACP condemn this? Why doesn't Urban League? Why don't black folks condemn this? And if it were Muslims, why doesn't this Muslim organization or this Arab American organization condemn this imam who said something in, Poughkeepsie or whatever? We know what the dialogue would have been. And so that's the thing. Whiteness has meant, above all else, the ability to think of oneself and other white people as mere individuals, even as you carve out for yourself and other white people a very distinct collective set of advantages. So you get to think of yourself as a mere individual, even though all of the structures that you created were intended to not treat you as an individual, but to treat you as a special person along with these other special people.
Let's assume that the commander on the scene had been black or brown. We don't know, because they have a lot of black, that's another angle here. These thugs did this. Also the rage in number one multicultural democracy. But think about where all these black folks in DC are employed. Let's imagine the commander on the scene or some head muckety-muck was black or brown. And they told those cops, deal with them. Enforce the law, and those cops, and I'm always hard on the police when it's deserved, they should have been busting some skulls. And if they had escalated properly, they would have ended up beating these people, tear gas mates, and probably shooting some of them. What do you think the narrative would have been then?
Oh my God. It would have absolutely, the sort of Blue Lives Matter, let's back the blue, would have been over with. They would have said, look at these awful out of control liberals in a liberal city, blame the mayor. They would have said, The mayor has empowered her black police. It's one of the reasons, if you see that one clip, and it's sort of heartbreaking and it's enraging, of those white folks chasing that black cop, chasing him up the stairs, and he picks up a crowbar or something. And at one point, you think he's going to swing it at that one kid, and he doesn't. And then he just runs up another flight, and they are chasing. And you know that those guys are laughing and having the greatest time intimidating this black cop. And I'm thinking, there is no way in hell that any white cop being chased up the stairs by a black person runs away from it. They're going to swing that crowbar, or they're going to pull their gun, or they're going to pull a taser. They're not going to play games with them. And in that moment, you now have a terrorist group that has broken in to the seat of government. This is not somebody who smashes a window at the Starbucks. I don't think the cops in that situation ought to beat folks or shoot them or tase them, because I don't think that in that moment, the threat, the larger existential threat, is so great that that kind of response would be appropriate. These people have taken over the seat of government. It seems to me your job is, in fact, to defend that building, not only as a piece of property, which is no different, let's say, than a Starbucks, but as a symbol of something which is far bigger than the Starbucks. And so in that situation, if there's any situation where a cop has got a right to swing a crowbar, it is when they are being chased by someone who's already shown you they're there to overthrow the government. Do you think they won't hurt your ass? That's the point where you're like, no, in that moment, I'm going to have to be on team cop for that moment.
Me too. And imagine that man's humiliation. I can't imagine how he feels, because he knows if he shoots these thugs, that may be the end of his career. These people were breaking in there to execute, kidnap, and kill those representatives. They had zip ties, they're armed, planted bombs everywhere. And if you want to see an example of the grotesqueness of white privilege, that these people were able to get and then leave like they were just rowdy at the mall, like teenagers.
They ran off the CNN crew and smashed their equipment. They're sitting there on, and none of them have got a mask on. They're breaking equipment, and they're broadcasting it, and there's nobody arresting them. One guy's taking a piss on the floor of the house, and nobody's arresting. I mean, they do finally clear it, but they were in there for minimum of a half an hour, if not an hour to an hour and a half, before that happened. And the fact that that is the case tells us that there is on the one hand, either that you've got a lot of cops of color who were afraid to use their power for fear of how that would play, which tells us a lot about this country and about the limits of the black officer to do good, so to speak, in a system that is so heavily aimed at protecting and defending white people at all costs and their prerogatives. Or what it tells us is that those individual cops, like that one guy aside, that the larger law enforcement structure in Washington that was there is amenable to Trumpism and is willing to let them have their way for at least a while. Yeah, ultimately, you got to do your job. You got to move them out. But for the most part, there were more cops taking selfies with these terrorists today than there were cops beating them or gassing them or arresting them, so far as I can tell. I don't know. We haven't seen the arrest numbers. They don't look proportionate to the amount of crime that was committed. And as slow as they were moving to get the National Guard in there and everything else, these terrorists are far more likely to catch a case of COVID long before they come down with a case of handcuffs, which is what they should have had early on in the process.
But when you watch the police cooperate, moving the gates, opening the doors, letting them in, what did you see? Because I saw a plot.
Oh, yeah. What I saw was a wink and a nod. I saw a certain number of members of the fraternity telling the other members of the fraternity, go ahead, have your party, try not to block the fire exits. I saw a law enforcement apparatus that is fundamentally reactionary and fundamentally not concerned with fascism and fundamentally amenable to fascism. And again, that doesn't mean every cop, but it means a law enforcement culture that simply looks at this differently, because in their mind, these perpetrators do not threaten what they have been asked to defend. What they have been asked to defend, they don't feel is threatened by white people, at least not white people who are reactionary and fighting for the maintenance of traditional hierarchy, which is what reactionaries are doing by definition. But if these are black or brown folks, or for that matter, white folks who are seeking to upend traditional hierarchy, They're not going to open up the barricade for them. They're not going to take selfies. They're not going to stand by while those black and brown folks or leftists construct a hangman's noose on the grounds of the Capitol. And so cops watch that and they're like, yeah, well, there's a lynching noose. All right, well, whatever, which is a direct threat against elected officials. I mean, there's multiple federal crimes. This is not ticky-tack stuff. I don't ever want to hear anyone talk about Antifa breaking out windows at a Starbucks again as being violent. Not after today. All bets are off. When I see that kind of stuff, it tells me we have a very sick law enforcement culture. And the elected officials of this country are going to have to demand a cleaning out of that law enforcement apparatus, starting from the Attorney General's office moving forward in the next 4 years.
The levels of denial. Trump, in public, in plain sight, put his agents throughout the government, and it will come out that they were enabling this. Just like the curious fact that the Pentagon, where he put his supplicants, his servants, delayed the National Guard and told them not to do it. Give me a break. I mean, this stinks to high heaven, and it's just getting started. But I don't know if you saw it, and it's a moment I think is going to be replayed many times, and I hope, fingers crossed, she doesn't lose her job over this because she told too much truth. Did you see what Joy Reid said? And they were doing their whole, we're shocked. This is unimaginable, unfathomable. You know the script they play to. She came on and basically said, as a black woman, as someone who's been in this country, I'm more afraid of the police. I've been at the Freddie Gray protests. I know what the police can do. I'm not afraid of those protesters. These people are scary. Why aren't they intervening? And she basically called out the culture of normalizing Trumpism and white privilege and pretending that this is all a surprise. She basically said, where the hell have you people been? And you could drop a pin. It was that quiet. It's like, you broke the rule. Why are you telling the truth?
White people are forever and always being shocked by the behavior of white people. There's this quote that I used to have as my pinned tweet. It's a Baldwin quote, and I don't have it memorized. I used to. But it's the one about white people in Germany were shocked that they could act this way. But I doubt very many black people were surprised. And the same is true here. White folks were shocked at what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd. Black people were not. White folks were shocked at what George W. Bush didn't do right before Katrina and during Katrina to save the city of New Orleans and the people who lived there. But black folks were not shocked. And once again, white folks are shocked by the inaction of the police in the face of white terrorism, and black folks are not shocked. At some point, white people are going to learn that if you want to understand this country, you need to listen to black people first and foremost, and craft your analysis and your understanding of your country on the skeletal framework provided by black people. Because black folks have had to know this country for 400 years, going back to the colonial period. White folks have never had to know anything about it other than that which we wanted to tell ourselves. And that's a huge difference.
We're talking literally on Wednesday, the day this happened. Who knows what the hell's going to happen? Trump may not even be president by tomorrow. We don't know. But what do you think happens next? And more generally with this movement?
I knew something like this was capable of happening. I don't know what happens after, but I think that what happens will depend largely on the way that the new administration responds. And my fear, of course, is that Joe Biden's default position for 45 years has been conciliation and compromise and trying to reach across the aisle and make peace in the name of unity and all of this. You cannot negotiate with terrorists. I don't care whether those terrorists are from another country or whether they are from down the block. You don't negotiate with them. At this point in the crisis, I tweeted this earlier, sort of like with the bully who's pushing you around to see what they can get away with. This is the part where you pop them in the mouth and tell them to sit their punk ass down. And the only way you can do that politically is if you say, we're going to have investigations, there are going to be prosecutions. And I think every responsible, reasonable Republican or conservative in this country, of which there are many, have got to say to all the rest, you have to now, if you haven't already done it, and not just in the last 12 hours, if you have been on this Trump train or you have been passively accepting it all this time, you now must condemn Trump, condemn Trumpism, and condemn this cult. And you must do it by name. You can't just say we condemn violence and we condemn chaos and we condemn disorder and we stand for the constitutional process. No. You have to condemn these agents of chaos right now. And if you don't do it, then those reasonable, responsible Republicans and conservatives have to commit to voting out of office every Republican in a position of power. They have to be held collectively responsible for what their mob is doing if the lesson is ever going to be taught that they can't get away with this. And then the Attorney General has got to begin investigating this larger movement of white supremacists, white nationalists, misogynists, QAnon conspiracy cultists as the domestic threat that they are. If we don't do that, they will be emboldened and empowered, and they will continue to grow. They may grow anyway. There's a lot of violence that they can do, and my guess is we are nowhere near the end of this. If you have any love for these people at all, you are the problem. If you want to reach out to these people at all, whether you're Joe Biden doing it in the name of compromise or Bernie Sanders doing it in the name of some stupid class analysis that these people couldn't care less about, you are the problem. These people have to be shamed. They have to be run from public life if that's what it requires in order for us to get back to a place where we can actually begin to build a multicultural, pluralistic democracy.
I would like to thank you for listening to this week's installment of The Truth Reports.